Okay, so now I'm going to talk a bit more about socioeconomic things, but socioeconomic measurement. Specifically the NZSEI, which we have developed for the 2018 census. Bear with me while I get this set up. And, well, I can talk while I'm setting up. This is work that Natalia is working on for her PhD, and I've had a bit of a long history working on it, and Nicola and Liza have helped with this, as is Andrew Spall, and Annie Kang from Stats New Zealand did a lot of analysis for us during lockdown, which was fantastic. And she was very keen to get this up and running. Okay, so let me share screen. That one. Okay, so that's the disclaimer again. What I'm going to talk about, what we're going to talk about today is I'll talk a little bit about the history of the NZSEI and what it is. I'll talk also about the 2018 census and what it was and what it wasn't, and why that may have impacts on why it may have impacts on various things coming out of the 2018 census, one of which is the NZSEI. We wanted to see if you could still construct the NZSEI that looks like the others that we've constructed, given what went on with the census with lots of people not doing it. Then I'll talk about the aims of the project, and I'll pass over to Natalia who will talk about the methodology, results, answering the questions about aims and conclusions. Okay. So the NZSEI, the New Zealand Socio-Economic Index, is a measure of socio-economic status or position. I prefer SES, others prefer SEP, for individuals based on occupation. So you're given a score that somehow indicates your socio-economic position, and it's purely based on the occupation that you are in. It's had a relatively long history, as I'll get into in the next slide. For me, I want to just clarify that when I talk about socioeconomic status, I'm not necessarily talking about social class or social status, although the two may be related. What I mean by socioeconomic status is some sort of multidimensional construct that captures the social and material resources individuals, families, and households have access to. Now, that's going to have a relationship to what we might think of as social class, and my relationship to the labour market or to work conditions will correlate with my socioeconomic score that we're going to construct for the NZSEI, but it won't be exactly the same thing. And it may not relate strongly, although it will relate to some extent to any perceived feelings of social superiority I may have or others may have in relation to where they sit in society. So just to be clear, I'm talking about socioeconomic status, not social class or social status, as much as those things sound like the same thing. Why do people going about measuring this? Well, I gave a whole talk on it, really. I think so many things are patterned by it, and you want to know where there are disparities in society so you can act on them. And if I think about the sort of work that Compass does, that's probably about 80% of it, looking at social stratification and how various outcomes, especially among children actually, various outcomes differ by socioeconomic factors. Also, and this is really common use for measures of socioeconomic status, if you're interested in a particular risk factor of some kind and whether it has an impact on some outcome of another kind, you want to see that that association isn't purely because there are socioeconomic differences in your exposure that relate to socioeconomic differences in your outcome. So you want to control for the potential confounding impacts of socioeconomic status. Also, there's been quite a literature for many years now looking at socioeconomic mobility, both within one's life and intergenerationally especially. And that, I think, is probably focused on more on occupational socioeconomic status than any other measure because it has been around for a long time. You can describe the socioeconomic conditions of populations. And also in New Zealand, more at the deprivation end, it's used for funding allocation. So the NZ-DEP scale, which broadly speaking is a socioeconomic scale, is used for funding allocations for health and other things, and contributes to the education deciles, which I know are being revised. Okay, they all have their pluses and minuses, and no one indicator is the be all and end all, and it's people do use more than one, but just running through them quickly. Income, which is commonly used, has face validity, is often, as I mentioned before in the previous talk, recorded administratively, but sometimes it's reluctantly reported, and there are underreporting biases, particularly for people who are self-employed. Education, again, is often used and is often recorded. It's stable past a certain age, so it doesn't fluctuate the same way income may, but is inversely associated with age. So a population in their 60s will have quite a different education profile than a population in their 20s, and so they mean slightly different things, I think. Deprivation or living standard measures have now got a long history. They're relatively easily coded. They can summarize across multiple adversities, but there will be variation within areas that are coded for deprivation, and to that extent an address may mislead. Individual-based ones that actually measure the individual household unit and the deprivation levels they have. That's what I also talked about in the previous presentation, in the SOFI sample. Also summarizes multiple adversities, but you actually need a questionnaire to find out what the level of deprivation or the living standards are of a particular household. Occupation, which I'm going to talk about here, is readily recalled. It is often recorded, although I think less so now. It's not as standard a measure in surveys as it used to be. It's had a long history of being valid. Coding is not particularly straightforward. In one of my first roles when I worked in the Needham study in 1998, and I haven't stopped doing this since, was to code the occupations in the Needham sample. And I know how much information you need to code occupation well. Just in the same way as individuals living in the same areas may differ, individuals with the same occupation may also differ, and it plows across all of that. And the biggie is how to code those not in the workforce, which we come up with a solution for with imputation, always have actually with the NZSEI. And for Natalia's PhD, won't be talking about this today, but for Natalia's PhD, she's looking at how to get household measures of socio-economic status based on the individuals in the household and their occupational SES. Okay, in terms of how it works, I'll probably just say briefly that its forerunner was the Alley and Irving scale, which has been constructed since the 1966 census, in various censuses since, and the former director of Compass, Peter Davis, he constructed the NZSEI using this path model, which is called the Return to Humans Capital model, using the 1991 census. We've done the 96, the 2006, and the 2013 census, and we're now working on the 2018. Basically, the Returns to Human Capitals model suggests that occupation is the means by which education is converted into income. Okay, so this is a path diagram here that suggests occupation is a function of education and age. Income is a function of age, occupation, and education. What the NZSEI does is assume that that B42 path is 0. It's not 0, but it assumes it so that the path from education to occupation to income is purely through occupation. So by not knowing what the occupation score is for each occupation, having a guess at them and varying them around, we can come up with the optimal weighting of education and income to get an occupational score, minimizing sums of squares on the B32 path and the B43 path, essentially. So what you essentially end up there with is a socio-economic score which equates to an optimal weighting of education income corrected for age. And we get scores from 10 to 90. And it looks something like this. So you can imagine there's 97 occupations that we code. I've given you 9 there. But each occupation gets a score from 10 to 90. And there's a range of some of them there. So medical practitioners, for as long as the NZSEI has been going, I think, has always been at 90, and various labourers typically are at the 10 end. Okay, the 2018 census had some issues with the data in that 1 in 6 New Zealanders didn't complete a census form, and there was big variations in the population about who did and who didn't across age, ethnicity, and geography. And this is an issue because if 1 in 6 people didn't complete the census form, can we construct a socio-economic scale that looks like it would do had everyone completed the census? That's what Natalia is going to talk about. And particularly of interest to us is the fixes that they used, given that they didn't have everyone complete a census. And basically, there were two main fixes. There was a third one that was related to what to do with people who were in prisons or in other defence establishments. But basically what they did is, we know we've got the census for these people, we know who they are, we can find them in the IDI, and we can define this thing called the IDI ERP Shore, which is the subset of the IDI who we're pretty sure were living in New Zealand in March 2018. Therefore, it's this extra group of people who are in the IDI ERP Shore but didn't fill out the census. They are the other people that we're missing. Let's add them in, which is what they did, they being Stats New Zealand. And after they did that, they've got the people, but they need to find out all the census variables of those people. So there were three sources that they looked to get those, to fill in the census fields for the people who otherwise didn't fill out a census form. And they were Census 2013 for things that didn't change much over time or didn't change at all over time. The biggest one probably used was administrative data, where they looked elsewhere in the IDI to see if there was a measure similar to the one or close enough to the one that they wanted to fill in from the census. Or imputation was a third one. And this was a form of donor imputation called CanCice, developed by Stats Canada, where basically you look for someone who looked like the person who didn't fill out the census form, and the person who looked most like them in their territorial authority, I think it was, you use their data. And for particular variables, as you'll see actually here, they used a combination of these things. So overall, for key variables for the NZSEI, which are occupation, income, and education, age is the other one, where they mostly got when they imported people from the IDI ERP Shore. About 20% of data came from other sources, and because it was filled in where you didn't fill out a census, if you got data from another source for one thing, you tended to get it for all three. So in other words, the people who were imputed for occupation tended to also have their income filled in from admin data and a little bit of imputation, and have their qualifications filled in from the admin data from education, or from what we knew about their education in the 2013 census, although there was some information that we couldn't get for education. That's so, we wanted to see if this had any impact. We wanted to find out whether or not the NZSEI, using 2018 data, patterned occupation similarly to previous versions of the NZSEI, and whether the NZSEI would look different if data from only those who completed the census were used. So if we say we don't trust the admin data at all, we're just going to use the census, would you get a different measure, and what does that say? Thirdly, does the NZSEI pattern occupation similarly across men and women and different major ethnic groups, which we've always looked at, the NZSEI? And does it show evidence of construct validity? Things we've always looked at are, do you pattern NZDEP in the way you would expect, where the low socioeconomic end seems to be high deprivation and the high socioeconomic end seems to be a low deprivation? And does it pattern smoking? And because we're in the IDI, we're going to look at three things that we couldn't look at before. Hospitalizations, which even though they may not be strongly associated with childhood poverty, are associated with, should be associated with socioeconomic status. Is that patterned by the NZSEI? Self-rated health from the General Social Survey, and life satisfaction from the General Social Survey. Okay, so I'll hand over now to Natalia, who will talk about what we did and what we found.
Okay. So the methodology for constructing the 2018 NZSEI is almost identical to earlier versions of the scale. Like other versions of the NZSEI, we restricted the population to working adults aged 21 to 69. Despite the retirement age being 65 in New Zealand, it is quite common to work for a few years after this point, but then labour market participation drops off. Below the age of 21, people tend to have jobs that do not reflect their skills and education levels, and hence people of these ages were excluded. So constructing the NZSEI requires data on 4 variables: occupation, education, income, and age. Occupation is coded to the Australian and New Zealand Standard Classification of Occupations, or ANSCO. ANSCO codes occupations to 6 digits. Each additional digit of ANSCO contains increasingly specific occupational information. We use the ANSCO classification to the minor group or 3-digit level to construct the NZSEI, which has 97 occupations. We converted highest qualifications to average years of education required to achieve the respective qualification. and we used log total income and inflated part-time incomes to the full-time equivalent. So after we calculate scores for each minor group occupation, we scale the scores so they fall between 10 and 90. We then applied a transformation to shift the mean of the scores towards 50. Earlier versions of the NZSEI applied a square root transformation. We used a slightly different transformation for 2018 to get the final scores to have a mean of exactly 50. So the 2018 scores are a bit higher than the 2013 scores. So on to the results for AIM 1, which was to check the similarity of the 2018 NZSEI with earlier versions of the NZSEI. This graph compares the 2013 and 2018 scores for each occupation. So here we can see that the scores are very similar for 2013 and 2018. The mean score for 2018 is a bit higher than for 2013 due to the transformations applied, and the correlation between the 2013 and 2018 scores is also very high. So the two key pathways in the NZSEI model are the path from education to occupational socioeconomic position and from occupational socioeconomic position to income. Here we can see that these paths are reassuringly similar for 2018 compared to 2013 and 2006, indicating similar socioeconomic relationships in the data. For 2006, 2013, and 2018, the education pathway is considerably stronger than the income pathway, indicating education has a greater impact on assigning occupational scores. So for AIM 2, we wanted to check that the use of alternative data is not distorting the results. To do this, we created two cohorts. The first just had records where occupation and income came from 2018 census forms. The second included all records where occupation and/or income came from alternative data sources. Generally, those whose data was supplemented on one variable tended to have had their data supplemented on other variables, as most of the missing data was due to missing 2018 census forms rather than partially filled in census forms. For those with alternative data on occupation or income, about 80% also had education from alternative data sources. So we may expect differences between these cohorts for two key reasons. The first is through differences in data quality between those with data from the 2018 census and those with data from other sources. The second is that the composition of the two cohorts may differ systematically. For this reason, just excluding records with alternative data is not a good approach. So we check for differences in education, age, and income levels within occupations across these cohorts, as well as whether there were differences in the levels of alternative data use across occupations. We also ran these cohorts through the NZSEI function separately to get scores and betas for these groups and broken down into level 1 ethnic groups. We then checked the similarity of the scores across these cohorts, as well as the strength of the relationships between the scales in NZ depth and smoking. So this graph compares the mean ages, education, and income levels for each occupational group across these three cohorts. The first column compares the mean values for the full dataset, which I have called the overall cohort, and the census cohort. The second column compares the overall cohort and alternative data sources cohort, and the final column compares the census and alternative data sources cohorts. We can see that the mean ages, incomes, and education levels for each occupational group are very similar for the census and the overall cohort. This is not surprising, as most records are classified into the census cohort. The alternative data sources cohort is younger, less educated, and receives less income for the same occupational group on average. We can also see that the proportion of data from alternative data sources varies across occupations. Major group occupations with lower NZSEI scores, which have been calculated as a weighted average of the minor group occupation scores, have higher proportions of their records from alternative data sources. So both the census-only scale and the alternative data sources scale are highly correlated with the overall scale, indicating a similar socioeconomic structuring of occupations. As you can see from the scatter plot on the left, the scores for the census cohort and the overall cohort are very similar. There are some quite large differences in the rank orderings of occupations between the overall cohort and the alternative data sources cohort, however. And the correlations between the overall scale and the census and alternative data sources cohorts, broken down by level 1 ethnic group, are all above 0.9. So the betas for the overall model are somewhat similar to that for the overall cohort, but are a bit weaker, especially for the education to occupational socioeconomic position path. The betas using just the census cohort are similar to the overall cohort. Importantly, all the census and alternative data sources scales, including those broken down by ethnic group, were significantly related to both smoking and NZ depth. However, the relationship with smoking seems to be a bit weaker for the alternative data sources cohort than the census cohort. Okay, and on to the results for AIM 3, which was to check that the 2018 NZSEI patterns similarly for population subgroups. So in line with previous versions of the NZSEI, we tested the appropriateness of the scale for different population subgroups. We tested this across many different dimensions, but here I'll just briefly present some results by ethnic group and gender. For these analyses, we used the betas calculated for the overall scale and ran the population means for all the relevant subgroups through the path model to get scores for each occupation for each subgroup. It is important to note that the results are relative to other subgroups and assume similar socioeconomic relationships across the population subgroups. So here we can see that men tend to be assigned a higher score than women for the same occupational group. Further analyses suggest this is due to men receiving higher incomes for the same occupational group rather than due to differences in age or education. So here we have the scores for 5 level 1 ethnic groups. We can see that Pacific peoples and Maori are assigned lower scores for the same occupation than other ethnic groups, whereas European, Asian, and Milne ethnic groups are assigned higher scores. Further analyses suggest the lower scores for Pacific peoples and Maori are due to lower average incomes and education levels for the same occupational group. The higher scores for Europeans seem to be due to higher average age and average income for the same occupational group, and the higher scores for Asian and Milne ethnic groups seem to be due to higher average levels of education and are in spite of lower average incomes than Europeans for the same occupational group. As shown earlier, the education pathway has a greater impact on the scores than the income pathway. Importantly, the correlations between scales for ethnic groups or genders are high, and the rank ordering of occupations is similar. This suggests a similar socioeconomic structuring of occupations, despite compositional differences across occupations. Furthermore, these patterns were found in previous versions of the NZSEI. So lastly, we have the results for AIM4, which was to check that the 2018 NZSEI has construct validity. Here we have plots of the regression coefficients for the 6th group categorical measure of the NZSEI with smoking and NZ depth respectively. These coefficients are presented in relation to the lowest socioeconomic group. Here we can see that the 2018 NZSEI seems to be related to both regular smoking and NZ depth after adjusting for age, sex, and level 1 ethnic group, with a particularly clear gradient for regular smoking. The relationship appears to be a bit weaker for 2018 than for 2013 for the 6th group categorical version, although they were slightly stronger for the continuous measures. And the 2018 NZSEI is also related to the odds of being hospitalised during 2018. We can see that those in the lowest socioeconomic group were more likely to be hospitalised during 2018 than most of the other socioeconomic groups. However, the 5th group actually had the highest odds of being hospitalised in this analysis. Life satisfaction and self-rated health were both related to the 2018 NZSEI. Those in higher socioeconomic groups were more likely to report higher life satisfaction and better self-rated health. So these analyses suggest that the 2018 NZSEI is performing reasonably well, despite the differences between the 2018 and earlier censuses. The NZSEI appears to validate well against the outcomes examined. The betas for the path model, ordering of scores, and patterns by subgroups are consistent with results for the 2013 NZSEI. Analyses by data sources suggest that while there are substantial differences between the composition of the census and alternative data sources cohorts, socioeconomic relationships are fairly similar, although by no means the same for both cohorts, including when split into level 1 ethnic groups. So we would like to thank our other project contributors, Nicola Shackleton, Liza Bolton, and Andrew Spall. We would like to thank Statistics New Zealand for providing access to the data and for their help and support throughout the project. We'd especially like to thank Ini Kang for helping us with analyses during lockdown, and thank you to all of you for listening.
Yes, questions?
So I was just wondering if you have broken down or considered disability when looking at individual cohorts, just because they are kind of a specific group in the sense that a lot of disabled people are quite highly educated. However, that doesn't translate into occupations or into good self-reported health. So I feel like that would be a cool outlier to look at.
Have we considered? No, but that's a really good suggestion. And actually, I think that's possible using the census data that we have. So we could look, for instance, if the same way that Natalia showed, whether occupations are patterned the same way for a specific disability subgroup. That would be possible. Is that what you're getting at, or are you suggesting that maybe the associations with health might be different for a disability group, which we could also look at? Write it down, we'll do it. Yeah. Natalia, by we, test this every which way. So, and presented some of it here, but that's not one that we'd actually considered before, but that is a really interesting one. Right. Yep, I did mention, yeah, it's not quite the, we work with Tristram Ingham and Bernadette Jones on a disability project with a survey I mentioned at the first talk. They might be interested in those sorts of aspects as well. So when I next meet with them, we might have a brainstorm about what we can do there. Thanks. Anything from the chat, Steph?
No, just like saying lovely.
Thanks, Liza. Hi.
Am I right in that stats just got occupation using the alternative source of occupation was imputation?
Yes.
And I mean, are you aware of, are there other sources there of occupation that you could try and have a look at?
Okay. Stats made the right decision to not look elsewhere for occupation data because it doesn't exist for the whole population anywhere else other than the census. But we look at the general social survey, and certainly for that survey cohort, you'll get income, sorry, you'll get occupation from those who filled out the general social survey, for instance, but didn't fill out the census. And so we could see if that made any difference. I mean, is it to my surprise? I mean, the associations were, it looked the same as the last NZSEI, regardless of the data that was thrown at it, pretty much. So I don't know if your question's about what stats should have done. I think they couldn't have looked elsewhere for the whole population. That wasn't just possible. But we can if we're just looking at a smaller group.
No, I was just wondering if it's imputation and they're taking that imputation from the wider census group, then they're just making it more like what they've got. And it would just be interesting to see how that compares with other sources. And yeah, maybe the surveys are a good option to have a look at.
Yeah, it's not just, I'm just thinking about it, it's not just the general social survey, but probably the household economic survey and the household labour force survey. And just to clarify as well, I didn't go into the imputation in much detail. They went through in modules, so they imputed a few things and then had a model to impute a few other things. But if you got in at an earlier stage, they used you. So you could have, a donor for your record, if you didn't fill out a census, may not necessarily have been a person who filled out the census. It may have been donated from where they got admin data for that, if both were possible for that particular record. So it's not necessarily just repeating the census people, although mostly it will be, given that they're 80% of the, you know, have 80% of data.
There was some interesting results in published as such, but just our experience of working with the Census imputation for the city housing deprivation estimate group. We've got people who are you know, living without shelter in Auckland, and then it looks like they've got a higher income.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, I was a little bit worried about what it would do. But again, another thing I didn't say is where they grabbed someone's occupation, if they were imputing income, they were grabbing income at the same time, and both of which was predicted by education. So all the three things that matter for what we're doing here kind of were built into the imputation process. So maybe that's one reason why it didn't matter too much.